The funeral home fell silent as the wooden doors swung open. Every mourner froze, conversations halting mid-sentence. No one breathed. No one moved. It wasn't grief that silenced them, though grief hung heavy in the air that day. It was shock, pure, unadulterated shock, as Zamba entered the room. 600 pounds of apex predator moving with unexpected grace across polished floors, his massive paws silent against the marble. His amber eyes, focused and alert, scanned the crowded room until they found their target, the polished mahogany casket at the front. Just 3 years earlier, no one would have believed this scene possible. Zamba was supposed to be dead, another casualty of the brutal wildlife trafficking trade that had stolen him from his mother when he was just 8 weeks old, confiscated from smugglers who had kept him starved and sedated in a tiny shipping crate. The emaciated lion cub had been given less than a 20% chance of survival. That was before Carter Williams found him. Carter wasn't a trained zoologist or a wildlife rehabilitator. He was simply a man whose rural property backed up against a small private wildlife sanctuary, a man who'd spent his life keeping a respectful distance from wild creatures. Yet when the sanctuary's director knocked on his door that rainy night, desperate for someone to provide overnight care for the dying cub when their facility flooded, something inexplicable compelled Carter to say yes. Nobody expected that single night to stretch into 3 years. Nobody anticipated that an ordinary man and an extraordinary lion would develop a connection that defied explanation, a bond that would ultimately lead to this unprecedented moment that left funeral attendees clutching each other in wonder and fear. What happened next would challenge everything we think we understand about the emotional lives of animals and leave not a dry eye in the room. Carter Williams had never considered himself an animal person. A retired construction foreman with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, he preferred the predictable rhythm of his solitary life on the edge of town. His modest home bordered the small wildlife sanctuary purely by coincidence, not by design. He nodded politely when he passed the staff on his morning walks, but kept his distance from their work and the animals in their care. The night that changed everything arrived with storm. Rain pounded against the windows as thunder shook the countryside. Just past midnight, frantic knocking pulled Carter from sleep. He opened his door to find Maya, the sanctuary's director, drenched and desperate. Flash flooding had compromised part of the sanctuary's facilities. The staff had evacuated most animals to safe areas, but they faced a crisis with their newest arrival. A lion cub, barely clinging to life, needed overnight monitoring and care that the damaged medical building could not provide. The nearest suitable facility was 4 hours away, and the cub was too weak to survive the journey. Perhaps it was a desperation in Maya's eyes. Perhaps it was the tiny bundle wrapped in blankets that she cradled against her chest. Whatever the reason, Carter found himself agreeing to help before he fully understood what helping entailed. The cub that Maya placed on Carter's kitchen table barely resembled a lion. Emaciated and weak, his golden fur matted with filth, the young animal had been discovered during a raid on wildlife traffickers. For weeks, he had been kept drugged in a shipping crate, destined for the illegal exotic pet trade overseas. The smugglers had removed his claws and filed his teeth, hoping to make him more manageable for wealthy buyers seeking unusual pets. Maya left Carter with emergency supplies, medication schedules, and strict instructions for the night. The sanctuary staff would return at first light. She promised. They just needed to get the cub through until morning. Carter sat beside the makeshift bed they created near his fireplace, watching the shallow rise and fall of the tiny chest. The cub, whom the staff had temporarily named Zamba, seemed more ghost than animal, hovering between life and death. Throughout that endless night, Carter maintained his vigil. He administered medications as instructed, gently cleaned matted fur, and carefully fed the cub small amounts of the special formula Maya had prepared. When Zamba struggled to breathe, Carter adjusted his position. When the lion shivered with fever, Carter wrapped him in warm blankets. Near dawn, something shifted. The cub opened his eyes, truly focusing on Carter for the first time. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, something impossible to describe passed between them. The cub managed to lift his head slightly, pressing it against Carter's palm with the faintest rumble in his chest. By the time Maya returned with a veterinarian, Carter had made his decision. The sanctuary's facility would take weeks to repair completely. Recovery for the cub would be long and uncertain. Carter offered a spare room as a temporary rehabilitation space, surprising himself as much as the sanctuary staff. Days stretched into weeks. Under Carter's diligent care and the guidance of the sanctuary's veterinary team, Zamba slowly gained strength. Carter adapted his home and life around the growing cub's needs, converting his covered porch into a secure outdoor space where Zamba could feel sunshine and fresh air during his recovery. The weeks became months, and something extraordinary developed. Despite the sanctuary's readiness to take Zamba back, wildlife experts began noticing the unusual bond forming between the man and lion. The cub, who had shown severe trauma responses to other humans, displayed complete trust in Carter. More remarkably, Zamba failed to connect with other lions during carefully orchestrated introduction attempts. Wildlife behaviorists and rehabilitation experts ultimately reached an unprecedented conclusion. The traumatized cub had imprinted on Carter so profoundly that separation might cause irreparable psychological harm. With strict oversight, specialized training for Carter, and significant modifications to his property, authorities granted an extraordinary exception, allowing Carter to establish a permanent sanctuary specifically for Zamba on his land. Over the following years, Carter transformed his property into a proper habitat, working closely with experts to ensure Zamba could live as naturally as possible while maintaining their unique connection. The man who once avoided involvement with a neighboring sanctuary became an unexpected champion for wildlife conservation, using Zamba's story to educate visitors about the horrors of wildlife trafficking. What began as one night of emergency care evolved into a lifelong commitment that would ultimately lead to the extraordinary events that were yet to come. The transformation of Carter's property matched the transformation in his life. What began as a simple home on the edge of town evolved into a specialized sanctuary. Under the guidance of wildlife experts, Carter constructed a spacious enclosure with natural features that allowed Zamba to climb, explore, and express his natural behaviors. A series of connected outdoor spaces gave the growing lion room to roam, while specialized fencing and safety protocols protected both Zamba and the occasional visitors who came to learn about his story. As Zamba grew from a fragile cub into a magnificent adult lion, their relationship deepened in ways that astonished even seasoned animal behaviorists. Carter learned to read the subtle shifts in Zamba's posture and vocalizations. He could distinguish between 20 different sounds Zamba made, each conveying specific needs or moods. The lion, in turn, developed an uncanny awareness of Carter's emotional state, often appearing at the fence line moments before Carter entered the sanctuary area, as if sensing his approach. Their daily routine took on a comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with Carter bringing specially prepared meals to different locations throughout the enclosure, encouraging Zamba to use his hunting instinct to locate and retrieve his food. They spent afternoons with Carter sitting outside the enclosure reading aloud from books, his voice serving as both enrichment and comfort for the lion who would often lie pressed against the fence nearest to Carter, eyes half closed in contentment. On special occasions, wildlife veterinarians would supervise limited physical interactions during Zamba's health checks. These rare moments when Carter could brush his fingers through Zamba's magnificent mane or scratch beneath his chin revealed the extraordinary trust between them. Zamba, who could easily kill with a single swipe of his massive paw, would lie perfectly still, rumbling with pleasure at Carter's touch. Their story drew attention. Conservation organizations invited Carter to speak at events, often sharing videos of his interactions with Zamba. A documentary filmmaker spent 6 months capturing their daily life, producing a feature that won awards at wildlife film festivals and brought their story to an international audience. Researchers from universities arrived to study their bond, hoping to understand the neurological and behavioral aspects of their unusual connection. Through it all, Carter remained humble, always emphasizing that Zamba was still a wild animal deserving of respect and appropriate boundaries. He used their platform to educate about the devastating impact of wildlife trafficking and the importance of protecting lions in their natural habitats. 3 years into their journey together, an unexpected health crisis tested their bond. Zamba developed a severe respiratory infection that rapidly deteriorated despite immediate veterinary intervention. For 4 days and nights, Carter slept on a cot beside the enclosure, monitoring Zamba's labored breathing and ensuring he received his medications. Even in his weakened state, Zamba would rally slightly whenever Carter spoke, his eyes tracking his human companion's movements. When Zamba finally turned the corner toward recovery, the veterinary team acknowledged that the lions with a fight seemed directly connected to Carter's constant presence. The lead wildlife veterinarian noted in her journal that the psychological component of their bond appeared to have tangible physiological effects on Zamba's recovery. As seasons changed and years passed, their connection only strengthened. Visitors to the sanctuary frequently commented on the way Zamba watched Carter, tracking his movements with an intensity that went beyond typical animal behavior. The lion seemed to understand Carter in ways that defied conventional explanation. He recognized Carter's vehicle before it was visible, anticipated his arrivals after absences, and displayed visible distress during the rare occasions when Carter needed to travel. On Carter's 60th birthday, sanctuary staff organized a small celebration in the observation area near Zamba's enclosure. As Carter opened gift from the team, Zamba appeared unusually restless, pacing and vocalizing. When Carter approached the fence to reassure him, the massive lion gently deposited a large branch at the fence line, one from a tree Carter had planted in the enclosure years earlier. Whether coincidence or intention, the moment brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. For 5 years, their lives intertwined in this extraordinary dance of human and lion, each growing and changing in response to the other. Carter, one a solitary figure preferring his own company, became an impassioned educator and advocate. Zamba, once a dying cub with little hope for survival, grew into a magnificent example of his species, his physical scars from early abuse visible but his spirit whole. No one could have predicted how suddenly this carefully constructed life would change, or how their remarkable bond would face its greatest test in the most unexpected way. Winter arrived with unusual force that year. Snow blanketed the sanctuary grounds, transforming Zamba's enclosure into a wonderland that fascinated a lion who had never experienced such weather. Carter spent extra hours ensuring the heated portions of the habitat remained functional, installing additional warming elements to keep Zamba comfortable despite the plummeting temperatures. The morning started like any other. Carter completed his usual rounds, placing enrichment items throughout Zamba's enclosure and performing maintenance checks on the heating systems. Sanctuary staff later recalled seeing him laugh as Zamba investigated a snowdrift, the lion's massive paws sending white powder flying in all directions. By mid-afternoon, Carter had retreated to his office to complete paperwork for an upcoming inspection. Maya, now the sanctuary's educational director, had arranged to meet him later to review their outreach program for local schools. When Carter failed to answer her calls, she initially assumed he was busy with Zamba or experiencing poor reception due to the weather. After an hour with no response, concern began to grow. Carter was meticulously punctual, especially regarding sanctuary matters. When Maya arrived at his home and found no answer at the door, the feeling of wrongness intensified. Using her emergency key, she entered to find Carter collapsed in his office, unresponsive despite her desperate attempts to wake him. The medical examiner would later determine that Carter had suffered a massive heart attack, likely passing away instantly while reviewing documents at his desk. At 62, with no prior history of heart problems, his death came as a devastating shock to everyone who knew him. News of Carter's passing spread rapidly through the conservation community. Messages of condolence flooded in from wildlife organizations worldwide, many from people who had never met Carter personally but had been touched by his and Zamba's story. The sanctuary established a memorial fund in his name to support rescue efforts for trafficked wildlife, raising over $50,000 in the first 48 hours. Among humans, grief manifested in predictable ways. Staff members comforted each other, sharing memories and tears. Visitors brought flowers and handwritten cards. Local media published tributes highlighting Carter's unexpected journey from solitary retiree to passionate wildlife advocate. Less predictable was Zamba's response. Maya was the one who noticed first. Having assumed responsibility for Zamba's care immediately following Carter's death, she arrived early the morning after the tragedy to find the lion standing motionless at the perimeter fence, staring toward Carter's house. His posture was rigid, his magnificent mane seeming to bristle with tension. When Maya approached, Zamba did not acknowledge her presence as he typically would. Instead, he remained fixated on the empty house, occasionally emitting a low, mournful sound unlike his usual vocalizations. Wildlife behaviorists advise the sanctuary team that animals, particularly intelligent mammals like lions, can sense changes in routine and may display signs of stress when caretakers disappear. They recommended maintaining Zamba's schedule as consistently as possible while gradually introducing him to new caretakers. Despite following this guidance meticulously, Zamba's behavior became increasingly concerning. The once majestic lion refused food for nearly 3 days. He paced endlessly along the fence line with a direct view of Carter's house. Most troubling, he began neglecting his grooming, his coat losing its healthy sheen as days passed. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned expert in big cat behavior, arrived at the sanctuary 1 week after Carter's passing. After observing Zamba for several hours, she delivered a solemn assessment to the team. "What we're seeing goes beyond stress from a change in routine," she explained. "I've worked with captive lions for over 20 years, and I've never witnessed a specific pattern of behaviors. The vocalizations, the focused attention on Carter's residence, the self-neglect, these suggest something deeper. While we must be careful not to anthropomorphize, the evidence indicates Zamba is experiencing something akin to grief." Her words confirmed what many staff members had already suspected but hesitated to voice. Zamba wasn't simply reacting to a disruption in his care routine. He was mourning. Concern for Zamba's welfare grew as his physical condition deteriorated. Despite the team's best efforts, including moving his favorite enrichment items to new locations and playing recordings of Carter's voice, Zamba continued his decline. He would briefly investigate these offerings before returning to his vigil by the fence, his eyes fixed on a house where Carter would never again appear. 14 days after Carter's passing, the sanctuary's veterinary team intervened. Blood tests revealed Zamba was approaching dangerous levels of dehydration and nutritional deficiency. They administered fluids and nutrients while developing a specialized care plan to prevent further decline. As funeral arrangements for Carter progressed, Maya found herself facing an unprecedented dilemma. Carter's will have been discovered among his papers, containing detailed instructions for his memorial service, along with generous provisions for Zamba's continued care. Among these instructions was an unusual request that initially seemed impossible to fulfill, a request that would soon lead to one of the most extraordinary moments in the sanctuary's history. Carter's will contain meticulous instructions for his funeral, reflecting the same thoughtfulness he had shown throughout his life. He requested a simple service at Willowbrook Funeral Home, followed by burial at Cedar Grove Cemetery, where his parents rested. He specified donations to wildlife conservation in lieu of flowers, and selected meaningful music to be played. These traditional requests surprised no one who knew him. The final paragraph, however, left executor Thomas Harrington speechless. Carter had written, "I ask that arrangements be made for Zamba to attend my funeral service, if wildlife experts deem it possible, without risking his well-being or public safety. Our connection deserves this final moment." Thomas, a longtime friend and the sanctuary's legal advisor, initially thought the request impossible to fulfill. The liability issues alone seemed insurmountable. Yet something about the simplicity and directness of Carter's words compelled him to explore possibilities rather than dismiss the idea outright. The funeral preparations expanded to include unprecedented discussions. Thomas convened a meeting with Maya, Dr. Vasquez, local authorities, and the funeral home director. Initial reactions ranged from outright dismissal to cautious consideration. "There's absolutely no precedent for this," stated Police Chief Garcia. "The public safety concerns are enormous. We cannot have a full-grown lion in a room with mourners." Funeral director Samuel Wilson expressed similar reservations. "Our facility isn't designed for something like this. The liability insurance alone would be astronomical, assuming we could even get coverage for such an unusual situation." Dr. Vasquez offered a professional perspective that shifted the conversation. "While I initially shared your concerns, I've been monitoring Zamba's deteriorating condition. Traditional interventions aren't working. From a behavioral standpoint, providing closure might actually benefit him physiologically. There's growing evidence that highly intelligent animals can process loss through ritual experiences. Maya presented Zamba's medical records, showing his rapid decline since Carter's death. We're running out of options for his well-being. Carter's request might seem unusual, but perhaps it deserves consideration given extraordinary circumstances. The discussions continued for 3 days as Carter's body remained at the funeral home. Gradually, a possible approach emerged. The service could be divided into 2 parts: a traditional public memorial followed by a private, controlled viewing limited to essential personnel, where Zamba could be present under strict safety protocols. Wildlife transportation experts developed a comprehensive plan involving specialized equipment and a team of experienced handlers. Veterinarians prepared sedation options, though they hoped to avoid using them if possible. The funeral home agreed to modify their largest viewing room, removing valuable items and creating a clear path from entrance to casket. Legal barriers required creative solutions. Thomas drafted specialized liability waivers while coordinated with local authorities to obtain one-time exemptions from wildlife regulations. Insurance representatives required extensive documentation and safety guarantees before providing temporary coverage. Throughout these logistical challenges, Zamba's condition remained a primary concern. The sanctuary team continued efforts to improve his physical state, ensuring he would be strong enough for the journey if all permissions were secured. A specialized transport enclosure was constructed with transparent panels that would allow Zamba to see out while remaining securely contained. 5 days after Carter's passing, the impossible began to seem possible. Chief Garcia granted conditional approval pending final inspection of security measures. The funeral home completed necessary modifications to their viewing room. Transport and veterinary teams finalized their protocols. Thomas secured the last required legal permissions with special consideration given to the unique circumstances and the lion's deteriorating health. News of the unusual arrangements spread despite attempts to maintain privacy. Media outlets began reporting on the lion at a funeral story, drawing both criticism and support from the public. Sanctuary phones rang constantly with questions, offers of assistance, and occasional condemnation. Maya found herself defending their decision to skeptical conservationists who worried about setting inappropriate precedents regarding wild animal management. "This isn't about humanizing a wild animal," she explained repeatedly. "It's about recognizing an extraordinary relationship and addressing a genuine welfare concern for a lion who is failing to thrive despite our best conventional efforts." The night before the funeral, final preparations were completed. The morning would begin with a public memorial service at 10 a.m., after which attendees would depart. At noon, a small group of sanctuary staff, veterinarians, and handlers would return with Zamba for a brief, private viewing before Carter's casket would be transported to the cemetery. As twilight settled over the sanctuary, Maya made a final visit to Zamba's enclosure. The lion remained in his now familiar position near the fence, his once magnificent form noticeably thinner, his eyes fixed on Carter's empty house. For the first time since Carter's passing, Maya allowed herself to fully acknowledge the depth of Zamba's apparent grief. "Tomorrow," she whispered, watching the lion's ears twitch slightly at the sound of her voice, "tomorrow you'll understand." No one could have anticipated exactly how that understanding would manifest, or the profound impact it would have on everyone who witnessed it. Dawn broke with unusual clarity on the day of Carter's funeral. The snowfall had ceased overnight, leaving the world crystalline and silent. At the sanctuary, preparations began before sunrise. Veterinarians performed final health checks on Zamba, confirming he was stable enough for transport despite his weakened condition. The specialized transport enclosure was positioned near his habitat, ready for the careful transfer that would begin once the public service concluded. The morning service proceeded as planned. Hundreds gathered to honor Carter's life, filling the funeral home beyond capacity. Speakers shared memories of his transformation from solitary retiree to passionate wildlife advocate. A video montage displayed moments from his years with Zamba, bringing both tears and gentle laughter from attendees. By noon, as the last mourners departed, funeral home staff quickly prepared for the unprecedented afternoon event. Back at the sanctuary, the transfer process began. Maya entered Zamba's enclosure alongside Dr. Vasquez and 2 experienced handlers. They approached the lion with measured movements, speaking in calm, familiar voices. To everyone's surprise, Zamba showed none of the resistance they had anticipated. When the team opened a transport enclosure, he rose slowly from his position and walked inside without prompting, as if somehow understanding their purpose. The solemnity of the moment was not lost on the assembled staff. Many had worked alongside Carter for years, witnessing the extraordinary connection between man and lion. As the transport vehicle began its careful journey toward the funeral home, a quiet hush fell over the sanctuary grounds. The procession moved slowly through town, a police escort ensuring clear passage. Curious onlookers gathered along the route, having heard rumors about the unusual funeral arrangements. The specialized vehicle, with its tinted but transparent panels, revealed glimpses of the magnificent creature inside. Those close enough to see described Zamba's demeanor as unusually calm, his gaze steady and focused forward as if anticipating their destination. At the funeral home, final preparations were complete. Furniture had been removed from the main corridor leading to Carter's casket. Security personnel positioned themselves strategically throughout the building. Veterinarians stood ready with tranquilizer equipment should Zamba become agitated, though all hoped such measures would prove unnecessary. The transport vehicle arrived precisely at 1 o'clock. As handlers prepared to move the enclosure inside, Maya noticed something remarkable about Zamba's behavior. The lion, who had been listless for days, suddenly seemed alert, his nostrils flaring as he sampled the air. When the enclosure doors opened inside the funeral home's rear entrance, the handlers tensed, prepared for any reaction. What happened next astonished everyone present. Zamba stepped from the transport enclosure with deliberate dignity. Despite his weakened state, he carried himself with a presence that commanded the space. Most remarkably, he made no attempt to explore or mark the unfamiliar territory, as would be typical lion behavior. Instead, he moved forward with singular purpose, following the corridor that led to the viewing room with Maya and the handlers moving alongside him. Funeral director Samuel Wilson, watching from a distance, would later tell reporters that in his 30 years overseeing services, he had never witnessed anything that affected him so profoundly. The animal moved like he knew exactly where he was going, Wilson recalled. There was an intentionality that defied explanation. As Zamba entered the viewing room, the small group of witnesses fell completely silent. The lion paused in the doorway, his amber eyes scanning the space until they locked onto the mahogany casket at the front. For several heartbeats, he remained motionless, as if processing the scene before him. Dr. Vasquez signaled for everyone to remain still, recognizing the critical nature of this moment. The handlers maintained their positions near Zamba, but did not interfere as he began moving toward the casket. His approach was measured and deliberate. Despite having eaten little for days, despite the strange environment and the presence of humans he did not know well, Zamba showed no signs of stress or aggression. He moved with purpose until he reached the casket, where Carter's body lay in peaceful repose. Those present held their breath as the lion circled the casket once, his movements slow and methodical. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft sound of Zamba's breathing and the slight tap of his claws against the hardwood floor. When he completed his circle, Zamba did something that brought tears to the eyes of even the most seasoned wildlife professionals. He settled onto his haunches beside the casket, assuming a posture reminiscent of the great lion statues that guard important monuments. His head raised, eyes forward, he took up a position that could only be described as a sentinel's watch. Maya, who had moved closer at Dr. Vasquez's signal, noticed a subtle change in Zamba's breathing. The rhythm had shifted, becoming deeper and more resonant. Then, from deep within his chest, Zamba released a sound that none present would ever forget. Not the typical roar associated with lions, but a low, mournful vocalization that seemed to fill the room without being overwhelmingly loud. The sound continued for nearly 30 seconds, vibrating with emotional complexity that transcended species barriers. As the sound faded, Zamba remained in his vigilant position beside the casket, showing no inclination to move. Minutes passed, extending beyond the brief time the team had planned to allow. No one spoke. No one signaled for the handlers to intervene. Something profound was unfolding before them, something that demanded respect and patience. For nearly 40 minutes, Zamba maintained his position beside Carter's casket. The lion, who had been refusing food and neglecting himself since his caretaker's passing, now exhibited a focus and presence that contradicted his physical weakness. He remained dignified and calm, occasionally turning his head slightly as if checking his surroundings before resuming his forward gaze. When he finally rose, it was with the same deliberate dignity that had characterized his entire visit. Rather than needing to be led back to the transport enclosure, Zamba turned and began walking toward the exit, pausing only once to look back at the casket before continuing his journey. The return to the sanctuary occurred without incident, the lion entering his habitat with subtle but noticeable change in his demeanor. The profound weight of what they had witnessed settled over the sanctuary staff as they watched Zamba move to his favorite resting spot. Not by the fence where he kept his vigil since Carter's passing, but beneath the large oak tree where he and Carter had often spent quiet afternoons together. What happened next would be reported in newspapers around the world. As the small gathering watched in stunned silence, Zamba slowly approached the open casket. The handlers tensed, prepared to intervene, but Dr. Vasquez raised her hand, signaling them to wait. With unexpected gentleness, the massive lion placed his paw on the edge of the casket and leaned forward. For a brief moment, his muzzle touched Carter's hand, a gesture so tender, so deliberate, that several witnesses later admitted they had to look away, overcome with emotion. Then came the sound, not a roar, but a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate to the floor itself. The lion's mournful call continued for nearly a minute, echoing through the funeral home. When it finally faded, Zamba settled beside the casket, assuming a protective position like the lion statues that guard sacred places. He remained there, unmoving, until Maya gently approached after 30 minutes had passed. To everyone's astonishment, Zamba rose without resistance and followed her back to the transport enclosure, pausing only once to look back at his human friend for the final time. News of the extraordinary funeral spread rapidly. Video captured by a staff member went viral, accumulating millions of views within days. Scientists who had dismissed the possibility of complex emotions in animals found themselves reconsidering long-held beliefs. The sanctuary received thousands of messages from people around the world who had been deeply moved by the lion's display of grief. For those who witnessed the event firsthand, the impact was transformative. Samuel Wilson, the funeral director who had initially opposed the idea, established a foundation supporting ethical wildlife sanctuaries. Police Chief Garcia became an advocate for reconsidering rigid regulations when exceptional circumstances warranted flexibility. Maya found herself invited to speak at conferences about animal cognition and emotional intelligence. Most significantly, Zamba's behavior changed following the funeral. The lion, who had been refusing food and neglecting himself, began eating again. Though still subdued, he resumed his normal activities and allowed new caretakers to establish relationships with him. Veterinarians noted his improved physical condition within weeks. Dr. Vasquez published a paper about the experience, careful to balance scientific objectivity with what she had witnessed. While we must be cautious about anthropomorphizing animal behavior, she wrote, we must be equally cautious about dismissing evidence that challenges our understanding of animal consciousness. What transpired between Zamba and Carter transcended our conventional explanations. The funeral became a touchstone in discussions about the capacity for grief in non-human animals. Experts pointed to other documented cases: elephants returning to the remains of deceased herd members, dogs refusing to leave their owners' graves, suggesting that emotional connections might cross species boundaries in ways science was only beginning to comprehend. Some questioned whether Zamba truly understood death, or was simply responding to Carter's absence. Others argued that the distinction mattered less than acknowledging the genuine emotional bond that existed. Perhaps understanding death was less important than recognizing love. 6 months after Carter's passing, the sanctuary established the Carter Williams Memorial Observation Center, where visitors could learn about his work and observe Zamba in his habitat. The lion, now fully recovered from his period of grief, would often approach the viewing area when children were present, displaying the gentle curiosity that Carter had always described as a defining characteristic. On the anniversary of Carter's death, Maya placed a framed photograph of him near Zamba's favorite resting spot. The lion approached it immediately, sniffing the frame before settling beside it for several hours. This annual tradition continued for years, a quiet reminder and extraordinary connection. Zamba lived another 7 years under the sanctuary's care, becoming an ambassador for conservation education. When he finally passed peacefully of old age, he was buried in a special section of the sanctuary grounds within sight of Carter's grave at the nearby cemetery. Two friends whose bond had changed how many people understood the emotional lives of animals. Their story remains a powerful testament to the profound connections possible between species when approached with respect, compassion, and openness to possibilities beyond our understanding. If this story touched your heart, as it has touched so many others, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more extraordinary tales of the animal kingdom. Every day, we share remarkable stories that reveal the depth and wonder of the bonds between humans and animals. Join our community of animal lovers and never miss another incredible journey that reminds us how much we still have to learn from the creatures who share our world.